The old term ignorance is bliss is true, but it really only applies to the person who's ignorant.
Yeah, that's true. That's okay.
Because there's nothing blissful about somebody else's ignorance. I mean, well, can we just say that?
No, yeah,
really?
there isn't, but it's your bliss to be ignorant about.
Some people have taken this as it's better not to know, or it's like, I didn't know. But really, sometimes it's the exercise of you wanting to perpetuate your own ignorance. So today we're going to talk about blissful ignorance, today on Curiosity Continuum.
Hey everybody, this is Josh.
And this is Brian.
Thank you for joining us today on Curiosity Continuum. For those of you tuning in for the first time, Curiosity Continuum is a podcast and movement started by two lifelong friends who want to spark your curiosity, help you integrate that information, and enhance your everyday contextual awareness in a constantly changing world. We're going to do this by sharing conversations with you that examine, explore, and reframe common practical topics.
So if you want to receive updates when new content's available, please be sure to hit subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you receive notifications when there's something new to listen to. And that actually helps us find other listeners because people see like, hey, so-and-so is listening to this. And we hope you would share it in an analog way and also in a digital way through podcast subscribing. So we appreciate you guys and gals. So please join us as we continue on and share your own curiosities with us.
As always, you guys can find us on curiositycontinuum.com. From there, you can link out to all of our socials, and we thrive on your feedback, and we hope to start a conversation with all of you soon.
So today, I said blissful ignorance.
That's what you said. Yep.
I did say it. And as much as let's even say that you don't like ignorance. You definitely don't like to be called ignorant. Ignorant doesn't always mean that you're willfully that way.
Right. It's more of a naivete type thing.
And I think it's important, especially as adults and in a very well-connected world that we live in, that we recognize those places and address them head on. There's a lot of things that have come especially to light even more now in the age of where people have a phone, they can film something. They can film social injustice. They can film horrendous things that are happening. Some people might say, wow, like I didn't realize that this is on the rise, when really it's always been there the entire time, but you're just being made aware of it now in a way that you maybe wouldn't have expected.
Right.
And it's actually hitting you in a place where you wouldn't have thought that it was there in the first place.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we could kind of like, the kids today would say you are woke or whatever, the whole woke topic, which is kind of, I don't really, subscribe to that too much. But what I do subscribe to is this idea that you might not have known something was happening. And you're just going about your day happy and carefree. And when you actually do figure out that it's been happening all along, or something has been, it changes your worldview, in fact, right, Brian?
It does. So,
and it doesn't have to be serious either. It can be something stupid that you just
it can be something
never
stupid.
knew that was happening.
Right. I think the thing that happens with people when there's terms that come up is that there's the original intent, and then there's people that would try to take it and make it something that is just for themselves.
Right.
It shows kind of like the self-centeredness of people to be able to take something and then say, well, then this really means this. Look, I really think about some of the church denominations in America. Now, I had a really interesting class in school, in college, that is, and the professor he said like he really subscribed to Native American Spiritism as far as his spiritual belief system and his worldview, right? But he was giving as part of the thing, because obviously the Christian church had such an impact on American culture in a lot of ways, that he showed the progression of how the denominations in this country came to be. It was really interesting to hear him account for those different kinds of things, because you began to understand that sometimes the group that was moving on was only named something by the group that stayed behind. You know,
Right.
Martin Luther's a great example in the Christian tradition, where he posted his 95 Theses on the door of the Catholic Church, and he had no intention of trying to like break up the Catholic Church. The history goes, though, that the Catholics said, well, those Lutherans are doing this, that, the other thing. Now, that was never Martin Luther's intent. He just wanted some reform within the existing structure of the Catholic Church. But it was the people who wanted to hang on to those things to say, well, those Lutherans. And we kind of see that kind of progress along for other reasons, as far as like when you see Anglicans and Methodists and Baptists and things like that. But let's take that example and let's apply it to greater culture, is that sometimes you are faced with something that hits your ignorance face on. And you could either dismiss it, you could either try to characterize it as something so you could more easily dismiss it, or you could actually sit there and chew on it. And really, everything that Josh and I talk about is that even if you don't fully see it or agree on it, like give it a good chance to chew on it, because you'll probably learn something. And you'd be probably really surprised about how some of those things would impact your life.
You know, and I kind of was talking about Brian about a story, and this is kind of a funny story, but it's kind of true in a way. I always said to you, like, remember when you were younger and like you didn't realize, you know, where the food came from or how you got your house you lived in or anything like that, and you were just happy, and you were just like, I'm a little kid, I'm happy, blah blah blah. But you always wanted to be older, and you always wanted to do stuff, and you always wanted to go to work, and you always wanted to do everything, and then you
Well,
got to be older, and you realize, you know what, it's not as great as I thought it was going to be. And that's kind of like how this is, you know. Also, I think it's not just the blissful ignorance of something, but it's also realizing that when you are ignorant of something, or not aware, I should say. Ignorant is kind of a term that people throw around a lot, which doesn't always work, you know, for what they're talking about. But when you're not aware of something, that's like a gift too, Brian. Like, not to be aware of something, and it doesn't have to be a serious thing, but just a simple thing. It's just something like a child, for example. I always tell kids, you know, hey, you're only a kid once. Don't worry about that now. You know?
Yeah.
Worry about it later. There's a lot of things to worry about later.
There's things that will meet you when you, especially in your cognitive development as a child, where you shouldn't process it at that time if you have the option to do it. Both Josh and I are very aware there are some situations, especially like my wife is actually an advocate for CASA, which is court appointed, you know, special advocate for children. And so there are situations that especially children are presented with, which no child should ever have to deal with.
Right.
And so there are things that you have to work them through, but that's considered a trauma. It's not considered, well, hey, guess what? Now you're of age to deal with this. Like, you're good.
Right.
There's something that's come to them that they didn't ask for, that they are now made aware of, that they have to learn to deal with. If we can be very honest, for as quote, normal as we would like to appear to everybody, there's no such thing. And we deal with things very differently. You know, this is an audio podcast, so, and if you've never haunted our social media, first of all, shame on you. You should be haunting our social media and engaging with us. You know, so Josh and I both grew up in central Minnesota, and so I was one of the few like non-Caucasian people in the school. Like, I was adopted from South Korea. My parents are Ukrainian, Polish, and English, Swedish. I mean, so even though, like, you know, like my parents look nothing alike, although my mom sometimes in certain interactions said like, oh, your son looks so much like you. Now I'm from South Korea. And I had to ask mom like directly after, like, have they smoked reefer lately? Because I don't know how they think we even look remotely alike. You know, it's a whole another topic for another day. But for Josh and I to be friends, like Josh and I became friends because it was like, we're friends.
Right.
You know, and we became that because people are people. Also, too, I'm grateful for a friend that, especially in growing up, where not everybody, obviously, but there are those who would try to target people who are different. And I was grateful for friends who loved me for who I was, and also would take up for me when those things happen. You know, when ignorance becomes weaponized, it's a terrible, tragic thing. And for me to be able to have a group of especially friends who were like a safe place for me, I didn't realize exactly how valuable that was even then until like my adult life, when you realize like, wow, this could have gone very differently for me just based on how I looked. And my friends never said, well, we're going to be friends with Brian because he is Korean, or we don't know,
Because he's good at,
like,
he knows how to figure out a tip. You know?
although I'll tell you what, because I usually was the smallest guy in amongst all the Scandinavians and Germans and folks like that, I usually got the middle seat in the car when we were all high schoolers driving around. And so
That's the ultimate cowboy. You don't have to drive, and you don't have to open the gate. You sit in the middle. You always
sit there. Those places, though, I appreciate even more because Josh and I have been friends. We've known each other since the third grade, and we've said this before. But those things really become meaningful to somebody, especially as you go through your adult life and you navigate different personal, professional situations, stuff like that. You really go like, man, I really appreciate that. Some of those things too, it's like, as Josh and I have gone along and we've shared things with one another, like, man, I never knew that was the case with you or that. I mean, that's just good friends sharing what good friends share. And it's good because there's an open dialogue where you can kind of learn from one another. And that's something that Josh and I talk about often is how we learn from one another, even in friendship and every other situation. Like, if you have an attitude of being open and learning, like, you'll become a better person in that situation.
Yeah, and I think, like where Brian is kind of like talking, it's a personal thing for him that he's gone through, and maybe we didn't even realize it when we were growing up, because we were kids, we just didn't realize all that stuff. But hearing that kind of stuff now is pretty powerful. And so I think that in our world especially, it just seems more polarized than ever. Why can't people just be people sometimes?
Right. And you wish they could be, for sure. We live in a world of colliding worldviews and moral judgments that we make that we feel like we should apply on everybody else. What happens often is that people will try to solve it for a way that they would like to view the world, right?
Right.
And that's not always the case. And that all of a sudden begins to feel unsafe to us. Although there's a very safe way that you can start to engage in the conversation with that type of thing. People that are different than us, different isn't bad. Different is different. And there's something we can always learn from it because we're all human beings at the end of the day, regardless of what you believe and regardless of what your particular worldview is. We can listen to one another. Like, we all have 2 ears and 1 mouth. And the old adage of like, well, if that's the case, you should listen more than you talk. But it's really true. I had a client actually that asked me a really, I didn't realize how meaningful the question was until he asked me the question.
Sure.
We were at lunch. We were talking about some of the things. This was an engagement I was on at the particular time. He had adopted a child, and I was like, this is really cool, and told me the story about it. And he looked at me with all honesty and sincerity. And so it kind of became a very personal conversation very quickly. You can spend a whole time riffing on business stuff very easily if you've done those things. And he said, what should I know as a white man who's adopted a child who doesn't look like me? Like, because that was your situation, Brian. He said, what's the wisdom that you can share with me? And it actually took me aback that he asked the question. I was very appreciative of it. And I had to stop and think and go, that's actually a really good question. Let me think about it. The wisdom that came out kind of from the era that I was adopted. So I was adopted in the 80s, and I came from South Korea, and a lot of the agencies that were in Minnesota, Michigan, Massachusetts, and things. The Lutheran Church was largely involved with helping bring South Korean children who were up for adoption over to the States. And the wisdom then was that obviously, like, you love them as who they are because they're a person and they're part of your family. And I 100% felt that love from my parents. They are wonderful people. There was a piece of it, though, where that's not how the rest of the world viewed me. And I learned that as I kind of came into school. And I found people that they viewed me just as Brian. They didn't care what I looked like. They didn't care that that was a particular way. It's like, hey, I think you're cool and we like the same things. Let's hang out.
Right.
And those people I really loved. And sometimes the mean voices are the bigger ones in your heart and mind when you hear that at that age with it. And there definitely were those voices there. To understand the differences and say like, hey, this is how people may perceive you, and that's okay. It was actually a conversation that didn't happen with me at the time. And I kind of had to wrestle with in my growing up and kind of into my young adult years to go like, why don't people perceive me the way that I perceive myself? And then you realize that you're met with a bunch of different assumptions made about people, about how they look, about how they may act, about how they dress, about what, how they, I don't know, they do something different with their weekends, or they work nights or something like that. There's just being different.
Yeah.
And there's so many different ways where you could easily just, as a default mechanism, go, I can't understand that person because can't relate to them.
Or it's wrong because it's different.
Right. And the goal is like, I want to understand you. Let me hear you.
Right.
I'm telling you what, that is so meaningful to people. And I've asked people too, like that I didn't know, like there was a gentleman that was missing an arm. Like if you're missing an arm, you kind of like notice that you're missing an arm.
Usually, yeah.
To everybody else.
Yeah.
And I didn't, skirt around it. I just asked him. I said, "Hey man, tell me the story about your arm. I would love to know." I said, "Hey man, I appreciate the question." And he told me the story about it, and we started the conversation that way. And I was just being honest. Like I wasn't trying to ignore the fact that his arm was missing. I just said, "Hey man, like tell me about that," because it's part of their story.
Obviously, a big part.
Yeah.
You could say it's at least a quarter, right?
Oh my gosh.
I'll edit that part out. I had to say it. I just had to do it.
I had to say it. Oh.
I couldn't stop myself.
Oh my gosh.
At least
you might have to leave that. You might have to leave that in.
I don't think so.
Well, no, I'll tell you this though. There was a story
Be a good
about
outtake.
a guy. Yeah. There was a guy that I used. There was a company that I used to work with that as I was transitioning out of the company, not because there was anything bad happening. It was like my personal choice as far as like what I wanted to do with my career.
Sure.
And there was a gentleman that was coming into the office who was kind of fulfilling the role of like an interim chief financial officer. And the guy had one arm, right? And because he had one arm.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
And so,
Yep.
and I think something happened where there was, it might have been something like with his heart
Sure.
or something that went wrong, and he lost that particular limb. And he would always he had a really good sense of humor about
Yeah.
it. And so like sometimes when people are like trying to skirt like, well, like I'm seeing you and I know that your arm is missing, but I'm not going to say that out loud. And like if he had to pick up something, he goes, "Hey, can you lend me a hand?" And he would, and people, it would kind of set the mood differently because they knew that he was kind of, good natured about it. And again, he couldn't do anything about it, but
No.
he was not trying to keep people in a place where you have to pretend like this isn't what you're used to. He just kind of addressed it head on, and it was helpful for
Because
everybody.
obviously it's not what you're used to seeing.
Right.
You're not
Yeah.
used to, because if you were used to seeing one-armed people, you would just assume that is the deal. Like everybody has one arm.
And then you'd be freaking out when you see the two-armed people walking
Exactly.
around like, oh my gosh, there's
Exactly.
two of these things. So Josh, the challenge here, I want to just affirm you as a friend. I want to say thank you for your friendship for all these years, and knowing that at the core we're all people, and at the core also too we bring different experiences and perceptions into it.
Right.
Continuing to forge a friendship for all these decades. I mean, it's one of the greatest gifts of my life to have you as a friend, and I truly mean that.
Well, thank you. And yeah, same. I mean, if I didn't have you as a friend, I'd be a lot shallower person, I think, because you check me a lot of times into like, Josh, that's not right. I'm like, okay. Or I'll like, I know, but come on.
Come on, Josh. Everybody's doing
Yeah.
it,
No, but I mean, in all seriousness, no. It's like you even said, like when we were growing up, I don't think we really realized how important of like a friendship we had until we got older, and you realize
Yeah.
that not everybody has friends that they have friends for like 30 years,
Right.
or longer.
And especially,
you know,
and then when you get to a certain age, you can't have the tenure that you do with them. So those things really become even more important in your life.
Right.
So value the friendships you have, and especially value new friendships in places where you may not have ever thought to find one. Dwayne Johnson and Kevin Hart are a great example in culture. Like right now, like they never thought they'd be friends, and then they met on a movie set, and they're great friends now. And they never thought they would be because they're so different. But I think that's what makes friendship so beautiful. Do those things and let those things rub against you in the good way to kind of ferret out the areas where you may be ignorant, because those are the loving situations where you can actually listen and kind of check yourself and become a better person.
Yeah, and you could also make a real difference. Even if you don't think you're making a difference, and you might be making a real difference in someone's life.
Absolutely. Let's put a comma in the conversation here.
Yeah.
So until next time, intrepid listeners, this is Brian.
And this is Josh.
For Curiosity Continuum.